Calvin Klein effect. Is Jungkook replacing Mark Wahlberg as the ultimate icon of American masculinity? Or is something bigger quietly happening? What if the most powerful symbol of American masculinity is no longer American at all? What if the body that once defined desire in the 1990s has been eclipsed not by louder muscles or sharper aggression, but by silence, discipline, scars, and emotional gravity? And what if Calvin Klein, one of the most historically American fashion houses, has already answered that question without ever issuing a press release? For more than 3 decades, the name Mark Wahlberg was not merely associated with Calvin Klein. It was Calvin Klein. In the early 1990s, when Wahlberg's body appeared in black and white underwear campaigns that bordered on provocation and defiance, the brand did not just sell clothing. It sold an ideology. A man was defined by dominance, physical force, visible confidence, and an almost confrontational sexuality. The Wahlberg era was loud even when the images were silent. His clenched jaw, tense posture, and raw physicality crystallized what Western fashion would call real masculinity for years to come. That image did not merely survive trends. It shaped them. Yet today, as Jungkook of BTS stands at the center of Calvin Klein's global imagery, a question ripples across international media, fashion circles, and social platforms with growing intensity. Has the Mark Wahlberg era officially ended? Or more provocatively, has Calvin Klein quietly replaced American masculinity itself? This is not a question of comparison for shock value. It is a cultural interrogation. Because when Jungkook appears in Calvin Klein denim, tattoos exposed, gaze steady but unaggressive, something fundamental shifts. The energy is not confrontational. It does not demand attention. It absorbs it. And that difference may explain why the response has been seismic. Unlike Wahlberg's campaigns, which communicated power through physical intimidation and overt sexuality, Jungkook's Calvin Klein presence operates on a different frequency. His masculinity is not something he performs outwardly. It is something he contains. His body, marked by tattoos that carry personal symbolism rather than shock value, does not scream rebellion. It suggests survival, discipline, and lived experience. And in the aftermath of his 18 months of mandatory military service, that quiet authority has only deepened. I asked this what masculinity looks like in the 2020s. The comparison exploded across American social media almost immediately after Jungkook's latest Calvin Klein photo shoot for Rolling Stone went viral in early January 2026. The images, first shared by fan accounts and linked to Rolling Stone Japan's special cover story titled, "An Artist Without Limits, That's the Goal I Aim For," ignited an engagement wave that crossed borders in minutes. Close-up shots of Jungkook's tattooed arms wrapped in Calvin Klein denim generated hundreds of thousands of interactions in hours, not days. Observers noticed something uncanny. These images were not trying to shock. They were inviting contemplation. Fashion analysts began using a phrase that would spread like wildfire: the anti-Wahlberg. Not because Jungkook lacks physical power, his physique is visibly sculpted, disciplined, and strong, but because his power does not rely on aggression. Where Wahlberg's Calvin Klein masculinity was about conquest, Jungkook's is about control. Where the 1990s celebrated dominance, the 2020s seem captivated by restraint, and Calvin Klein appears to have understood this before anyone else said it out loud. The brand that once built its empire on American bravado is now fronted by a South Korean global pop icon whose influence stretches across continents, languages, and generations. Critics initially framed this as controversy. Was Calvin Klein abandoning its American roots? Was the brand sacrificing legacy for virality? Or was it simply following numbers? The data tells a story that emotion alone cannot dismiss. Digital engagement around Jungkook's Calvin Klein campaigns has consistently outperformed legacy-era benchmarks. His reach is not limited to traditional fashion audiences. It includes Gen Z consumers who do not remember Mark Wahlberg's original campaigns, millennials who grew up with BTS as a global phenomenon, and older demographics who are witnessing a cultural shift they did not anticipate. Jungkook does not replace Wahlberg in memory. He replaces him in relevance. And relevance, in fashion, is currency. What makes this transition especially unsettling for some observers is that Jungkook's masculinity does not fit neatly into Western archetypes. He does not project machismo in the American sense. He does not posture as untouchable. In interviews, including his recent Rolling Stone Japan conversation, Jungkook speaks with pragmatic realism. He describes himself as someone focused on the present moment, uninterested in glorifying the past or obsessing over the future. He discusses his disciplined lifestyle post-military service, even casually mentioning his one-meal-a-day diet with a smile that feels almost disarming in its honesty. This is not the language of a man selling fantasy. It is the language of someone grounded in process, and that, paradoxically, may be what makes him irresistible. Mark Wahlberg's Calvin Klein image emerged from an America intoxicated by physical extremes. The 1990s were about excess, visibility, and confrontation. Jungkook's rise comes from a world exhausted by that very noise. In an era of constant digital performance, his stillness feels radical. In a time when masculinity is under scrutiny for its historical harm, his emotional openness feels corrective rather than threatening. This is why the debate has moved beyond fashion pages into cultural commentary. Because if Calvin Klein, once the global export of American male identity, is now defined by Jungkook, then the brand is not simply changing faces. It is redefining values. Some American commentators have reacted defensively, questioning whether Calvin Klein has lost its American soul. Yet this argument assumes that American identity is static. Calvin Klein itself was once revolutionary, controversial, accused of corrupting youth culture. Mark Wahlberg's campaigns were criticized in their time for being too explicit, too aggressive, too raw. What history remembers as iconic was once considered dangerous. Is Jungkook's presence any different? The numbers suggest otherwise. His Calvin Klein imagery does not alienate American consumers. It expands the audience. It brings in global markets that were previously peripheral. It speaks to a generation that values vulnerability alongside strength, artistry alongside discipline. And perhaps most tellingly, Jungkook does not attempt to erase Wahlberg's legacy. He simply exists in a different era, answering a different question. If Mark Wahlberg once asked, "How powerful can a man look?" Jungkook seems to ask, "How deeply can a man be felt?" That distinction matters. The Rolling Stone photo shoot further reinforced this narrative. Shot by photographer Taehyung Jr. and styled by Kim Young-jin, the imagery balanced casual denim with luxury restraint. There was no forced provocation, no exaggerated posing. The tattoos, microphones, hearts, handwritten symbols were not props. They were autobiographical fragments. Each mark told a story, whether the viewer understood it or not. And that is where Jungkook's Calvin Klein effect becomes undeniable. He does not sell fantasy through anonymity. He sells intimacy through specificity. This is also why comparisons to Wahlberg feel increasingly insufficient. Because the real story is not about replacement. It is about evolution. Calvin Klein is no longer selling an American man to the world. It is selling a global man to himself. And Jungkook, with his journey from a 15-year-old debuting as BTS's youngest member to a solo artist whose album Golden has surpassed 6.2 billion Spotify streams, embodies that transformation. His success is not accidental. It is cumulative. It is built on years of visibility, vulnerability, discipline, and global connection. When his single 7 Feet Lato topped the Billboard Hot 100 in 2023, it was not merely a musical achievement. It was a cultural signal. Jungkook was no longer just a K-pop star. He was a global standard setter. Fashion followed. Calvin Klein did not create Jungkook's masculinity. It recognized it. And that recognition may be the most strategic move the brand has made since the 1990s. As BTS prepares for full group activities following the completion of military service by all members, Jungkook stands at a unique intersection. He is both a returning soldier and a global pop icon, both grounded and aspirational, both disciplined and emotionally accessible. That duality resonates in a world searching for balance. When critics ask whether Mark Wahlberg has been officially replaced, they may be asking the wrong question. The real question is this: can masculinity ever go back to being what it was after Jungkook showed the world what it could become? Because Calvin Klein's choice is not a rejection of history. It is an admission of reality. The future of masculinity is no longer defined by one nation, one body type, or one emotional register. It is defined by resonance, and right now, nothing resonates louder than Jungkook's quiet power. If this is not the end of an era, it is undeniably the beginning of another. And the most unsettling part, Calvin Klein did not announce the shift. It simply let the world feel it. The silence that followed Calvin Klein's newest imagery was not emptiness. It was absorption. In fashion history, the most dangerous moments are not when audiences shout, but when they stop and stare. That is exactly what happened as Jungkook's Calvin Klein presence continued to circulate across American, European, and Asian media ecosystems. The conversation did not peak and vanish. It deepened. And with that depth came an unavoidable realization. This was no longer a campaign. It was a cultural recalibration unfolding in real time. And American fashion commentary, a subtle shift in language began to appear. Editors stopped describing Jungkook as a celebrity ambassador and started framing him as a cultural mirror. That distinction matters. A celebrity sells a product. A mirror forces a society to examine itself. Jungkook's Calvin Klein imagery did not ask viewers to desire him in the traditional sense. It asked them to reconsider why they desire what they desire. This is where the Mark Wahlberg comparison becomes less about bodies and more about psychology. Wahlberg's Calvin Klein masculinity emerged at a time when America was exporting certainty. The Cold War had ended. The US dominated global pop culture. Confidence was not questioned. It was assumed. Masculinity reflected that assumption. It was loud because the world was listening, but the 2020s are not built on certainty. They are built on fragmentation. Global audiences are no longer passive recipients of American ideals. They are active participants in redefining them. Jungkook's rise within Calvin Klein occurs precisely because he does not impose an identity. He negotiates one. That negotiation is visible in his posture, his expressions, even in what he withholds. Unlike the confrontational gaze of Wahlberg's campaigns, Jungkook's eyes do not challenge the viewer. They hold space. That subtlety has been repeatedly noted by US-based fashion psychologists, who argue that modern audiences are increasingly drawn to figures who appear emotionally regulated rather than emotionally explosive. In this reading, Jungkook's masculinity is not softer. It is more controlled. And control, in an era of overstimulation, reads as power. The tattoos, often discussed as visual shock points, function differently under this lens. In Wahlberg's era, the body itself was the message. With Jungkook, the body is a text. Each tattoo invites interpretation rather than consumption. They suggest history rather than rebellion. This transforms the Calvin Klein canvas from a billboard into a narrative surface, and narratives travel further than images. The Rolling Stone collaboration amplified this effect dramatically. The cover story's title, "An Artist Without Limits, That's the Goal I Aim For," was not a slogan. It was a thesis. Jungkook positioned himself not as a finished product, but as a process. In American pop culture, where male icons are often framed as complete, dominant figures, this framing was quietly radical. He spoke about enjoying the present moment, about pragmatism, about discipline. Even his casual mention of eating once a day was not framed as spectacle, but as routine. There was no performance of suffering, no dramatization of effort. This authenticity unsettled some critics precisely because it did not conform to expected narratives of stardom. For Calvin Klein, however, this authenticity is strategic gold. Brands no longer survive on aspiration alone. They survive on alignment. Jungkook aligns with a generation that is skeptical of excess, allergic to inauthenticity, and deeply attuned to emotional nuance. He does not sell the fantasy of being untouchable. He sells the possibility of being intentional. That is why accusations that Calvin Klein has abandoned America miss the point. The brand has not left America. America has changed. And Calvin Klein has chosen to reflect that change rather than resist it. In fact, many American consumers see Jungkook not as foreign, but as familiar in a new way. His story of growth, discipline, and reinvention mirrors values that America itself has long claimed to champion. The difference is that Jungkook embodies those values without arrogance. He does not declare greatness. He demonstrates it quietly. This quiet confidence is what makes the anti-Wahlberg label simultaneously accurate and incomplete. Jungkook is not the opposite of Wahlberg. He is the answer to a different cultural question. Wahlberg represented what masculinity needed to assert in the 1990s. Jungkook represents what masculinity needs to reconcile in the 2020s.